The Measure of Consistency, the Fit for an Autopsy Discography Ranking. The story of how I got into metal and how that shifted into and became a passion for metalcore is a long story. It's a story I think I've told in small portions in various different places between my channels, and one I don't desperately need to delve into for this video. The long and short is that I was into metalcore, and it was my favorite genre for a couple years already by the time I really started to dabble into deathcore. Fit for an Autopsy wasn't the first deathcore band I tried, but back in early 2019, their, at the time, most recent release, The Great Collapse, was seminal in turning me into a fan. If not a fan of the whole genre, I was at least interested in what some major artists in the genre were doing, and Fit for an Autopsy was right at the top of the pack. Basically, ever since then, I have credited them with being my favorite deathcore band, and I followed their work very closely. So today, in light of their seventh studio album's release, I decided I would rank their entire discography from worst to best, or at least from least favorite to favorite, as the case may be, in light of the topic being heavily opinion forward. Without further ado, let's begin. 7. The Process of Human Extermination in 2011. A worthy debut, but doesn't stand out from the crowd. My rating is 2.5 out of 5. The Process of Human Extermination is a fine album, and for a debut, it might even be better than anything I could put out myself, presuming, of course, I could play the instruments to actually put to a DAW what is in my head. To say that the record is bad, though, would be false, but it's also not necessarily something I ever really come back to. I do come back to it when I do Fit for an Autopsy catalog spins like recently, but beyond that, I simply don't. On the one hand, Fit for an Autopsy in the early years obviously understood what deathcore was at the time and how to capitalize on those ideas. On the other hand, the primary downfall of this, their first studio outing, comes down to the exact same thing. Like most of the genre in the early 2010s, deathcore had a sound, but it was starting to sound ubiquitous across artists, thus the pitfall of early Fit for an Autopsy. Most of the songs on The Process of Human Extermination simply sound way too similar to one another, although some standouts do exist. Unfortunately, remembering which of those songs are the standouts when every song is titled the insert one word noun here can be a bit difficult, and also speaks to the level of memorable the album is. Namely, it's just not memorable. Besides the first 5 seconds of the first song, I could not possibly conjure up a moment from The Process of Human Extermination off the top of my head if I tried. In addition, while the band's original vocalist had some great lows, he ultimately fell into the trap that former Thy Art Is Murder vocalist CJ McMahon had for a while. Not enough variation. Sure, Fit for an Autopsy has always been nice for being easy to use for introducing deathcore to people, since their lack of intense vocal gymnastics and slower pace is much easier to stomach than, say, the common blackened variety we see in the genre today, and which is notably unfriendly to new listeners. But the band's early work doesn't set itself apart either. The instruments are the only thing that can make songs unique here, and even that is a fast-paced, constant blast beat style rather than the musical tendencies Fit for an Autopsy would later adopt. The Process of Human Extermination is by no means bad, it's just lacking variety and uniqueness, a bit too derivative of the bands that had emerged and become juggernauts before them. At the very least, it put the band on the map, and that's all they needed. Standout tracks include The Juggernaut, The Locust, and The Jackal, though I don't really have a favorite amongst those three. In 6th place, Hellbound, 2013. Building upon the last album, while hinting at what's to come, I give this 3 out of 5. While Hellbound in its entirety is not entirely focused on the future of Fit for an Autopsy, it certainly has moments that are, and those moments tend to be its strongest. Nowhere is this more notable than on the opening track titled The Great Gift of the World. Coming immediately off of The Process of Human Extermination, this opener is almost jarring for the band, an immediate eye on the evolution they do on future records. But not all of the album pushes the envelope so much. Many of the tracks continue in the vein of the preceding effort, but the sophomore does manage to utilize the new soundscape, or at least some of the interesting components of it, to adapt and evolve the generic deathcore sound into something at least a little bit more unique. This is the main thing Hellbound has going for it. The second and final studio album to feature Nate Johnson, the founding vocalist of Fit for an Autopsy, Hellbound is strangely kind of like a last hurrah for him, while also moving to really make a name for the band. Not only does the songwriting improve, but the drums specifically do too, a point made obvious by the change of drummer in between these first two records, drumming that grounds the entirety of Fit for an Autopsy's catalog from this point forward. Overall, the sound here is more familiar to the band's identity than the debut outing was, even when it continues to sound similar. Standout tracks include The Great Gift of the World, Do You See Him, which is my favorite, and Tremors. For a quick honorable mention, let's discuss some miscellaneous songs released between 2016 and 2023, an eclectic group of B-sides yet worth a listen, which I'll give an on-balance rating of 3.5 out of 5, even though there's no real proper rating system to that. Let's take a quick break to talk about the approximately half-dozen non-album tracks the band has released between 2016 and now. Those tracks would be their output on the Depression Sessions and the Aggression Sessions, split EPs with Thy Art is Murder on both, The Acacia Strain on the former, and Malevolence on the latter, released in 2016 and 2023 respectively, plus the separate single Fear Tomorrow, and sort of the cover they did of Walk With Me in Hell by Lamb of God. While I don't think either Sessions EP is fantastic in full, each contain some banger tracks. Each of the three artists on each EP produced 2 songs for the bodies, and where Fit for an Autopsy specifically is concerned, each contains one incredible song and one far less memorable one. The Perfect Drug is a bit weird, while Flatlining is phenomenal, and a song I've been heavily sleeping on. Under a Serpent's Sun is a bit generic, while Hellions is similarly stand out to Flatlining. Fear Tomorrow isn't anything I used to consider special, but it definitely has its appeal coming back around to it years later, and I didn't particularly like the Lamb of God cover, though my lack of familiarity with Lamb of God may be partially to blame for that one. What these 5/6 songs do is give a fine taste of some of the variety and experimentation that Fit for an Autopsy is great at, even if not showcased on their own full bodies of work. Besides, they all also have Joe Bad rather than their original vocalist, and in my opinion, everything with Joe is better. Standout tracks amongst the variety include obviously Flatlining and Hellions, which is one of my favorite Fit for an Autopsy songs. In 5th place, The Nothing That Is, from 2024. A bold new adaptation of their formula, albeit not my personal favorite version. I give this 3.5 out of 5. This is probably my one true hot take for this ranking. I'll try my best to explain, but something about The Nothing That Is just doesn't click for me quite the same way as the rest of the Fit for an Autopsy discography featuring Joe Bad as a vocalist. Granted, I used to say the same thing about another record we'll obviously discuss later in the video, but despite playing The Nothing That Is a solid half-dozen times or so since its release, somewhere on the upper end of average rotations prior to a post-new release album ranking for me, I still feel much more underwhelmed than it seems the community at large is. To give the album its due, I respect the decisions made here, whether they fully resonated with me or not. The songwriting decisions are a little different from their typical style, not too different mind, but enough to be noticeable. The choruses are more soaring, and the most explicit use of basically full, clean vocals is pretty new here, even for Fit for an Autopsy. But for some reason, I always hone in on the things I like less with this album, compared to previous. The single choices don't really fit in line with the traditional Fit for an Autopsy showcases, and don't really feel representative of the record to me. The volume mixing doesn't seem up to snuff, The interesting ideas tend to overshadow the songs they're in. The closer is pretty underwhelming, even by the standards of a band that has slow burn endings to many of their full releases. Despite my criticisms, however, the Nothing That Is still a fully worthy entry in the Fit for an Autopsy discography, and I will return to it occasionally, if not so often as I do with the rest of the ranking. Maybe I'll come back in a year or two and realize I'm underrating it right now. Standout tracks include Hostage, my favorite song Spoils of the Horde, and Lurch. Just outside of the top 3 at number 4, Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell from 2015. Breaking new ground, albeit a little bit inconsistent. I give this a rating of 4 out of 5. Replacing a vocalist can be a hell of a trial for any band. Between a sometimes iconic sound or specific artist identity that jives with an artist, there seem just as many cases of artists collapsing as there are of them thriving under the helm of new vocals. Not so with Fit for an Autopsy. In fairness, it is hard for deathcore vocalist replacements to make that big of a difference, but it is more than worth noting that not only did Fit for an Autopsy obviously not collapse following Nate Johnson's leaving and Joe Bad's recruitment, the band absolutely thrived in light of this change. Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell was a home run for a follow-up to Hellbound in every way possible. The songwriting takes again a huge leap, following after the best moments of Hellbound and refusing to be bound by the generic ideas of the genre. It seemed the band said, "Oh, you thought the last opener was good? Try this one out." The title track yet remains potentially Fit for an Autopsy's most iconic riff. It most certainly is one of their best and most recognizable singles. And the rest of the album follows suit. While it doesn't quite reach the heights of most of their following records, Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell showed the scene they were out for blood, and they certainly got it. Joe's vocals really helped the record to stand out, and the soundscape is expanded in what became the band's signature, subtle production choices leading to something that really sounds different. There's a subset of fans who still consider this one to be the band's best for good reason. I could see myself being salty, pun mildly intended, for the best songs both being singles, but since I wasn't around during the album cycle, I have no reason to complain. Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell slaps, and where previous albums walked, this one certainly ran. Standout tracks include Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell, and Salt Wound, which is my favorite. Both of these songs were the singles for the record, hence the sort of pun earlier, and Storm Drains as well. Cracking the top 3 in third place, Oh What the Future Holds from 2022. Arguably the band's most consistent record, a groovy and fun album, which I will give a 4 out of 5. I'm not gonna lie, I really struggled with where to place this album. You remember when I talked just a couple of places ago about the Nothing That Is? In summary, I feel somewhat underwhelmed compared to the broader audience of the album. Something about the ideas of the album in the way they're presented doesn't click so solidly for me, and while I enjoy it, I consider it notably weaker than its predecessors. I once said the exact same thing about Oh What the Future Holds. I'm serious, by the way. This ranking you're watching right now is actually adapted from one I originally posted on my website in 2022, shortly after this record dropped. And many of the general sentiments, not necessarily the specific criticisms, just the overall opinions, were similar to how I currently feel on the now newest album. I felt like Oh What the Future Holds was a continuation of the things that make Fit for an Autopsy shine. Great riffs that got even more groovy, great production that builds on everything that came before, and a solid variety of songs that keep the record feeling fresh. But for some reason I cannot understand anymore, I didn't click with this one a few years back. Now I do. Refreshing myself on it now, I actually found that it is arguably their most consistent album to date. The track list is actually genius. Where I used to criticize the single forward front half that took too long to get to the fantastic train of deep cuts the back half contains, now I see just how well balanced the record is. I definitely slept on the singles back in 2022, and I like the deep cuts even more than I already did before as well. Joe's vocals are even more standout than normal, and the drums ground the musicality in a very surreal way. Overall, I really loved this revisit to Oh What the Future Holds, and I am sure I will return to it more often now that I woke up to how good it is. I hope I have a similar attitude change happen with The Nothing That Is at some point in the future. Standout tracks include A Higher Level of Hate with a very addictive riff, Savages, which is my favorite, and Conditional Healing. In second place, The Great Collapse from 2017, the album that put deathcore on my map and made me a fan. My rating is 4.5 out of 5. The Great Collapse is an absolute powerhouse of an album release. It first came onto my radar after I fell in love with Trivium around the release of The Sin in the Sentence back in 2017, when Matt Heafy, guitarist and vocalist of Trivium, shouted The Great Collapse as one of his favorite albums of that year. The only problem was I was not ready for deathcore back then, so my first exposure to the record was basically just the opening track before I promptly noped out immediately. Yet the album remained front of mind for the next year or so, and I did eventually try exploring deathcore again in mid 2018 and early 2019 especially. At that time, I was more ready for what the band and genre had to offer, having become an absolute metalcore fanatic in the time since my love for Trivium. When I did come back around to trying Fit for an Autopsy back then with The Great Collapse, it was like my third eye or something opened. It was transcendental. I will always credit Dear Desolation by Thy Art is Murder, The Valley by Whitechapel, and The Great Collapse by Fit for an Autopsy as the seminal trifecta of deathcore albums that finally found me converted. As time has gone on, that love for this album has not ceased. It is a blistering throughput of great musical ideas that continued to evolve the band and put them into the big leagues of the genre. Similar to Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell, this also contains a couple of the band's most iconic moments, albeit more in the form of a breakdown in the second track and the interesting slow burn executions on basically the whole back half, which became a sort of trend for the band. In addition to stellar songwriting, the production is fantastic. The way that the mixing and mastering of Joe's voice melds with the instrumentation is the most exceptional part. Will Putney knew just how to make it come together, so Joe's just quiet and subtle enough to be oppressive, but loud and forefront enough to be emotional in the slow and quiet moments, and that is out of this world. This album is a stupendous offering, and I will always have a soft spot for it. It fully deserves this spot on the ranking. Standout tracks include my favorite, Heads Will Hang, Black Mammoth, and When the Bulbs Burn Out, although I have to admit that opening the track with a monologue by Leo DiCaprio is very corny and pretty cheesy, and I don't really like that, but the rest of the song is just too good to not include it here. And finally, in the top spot, The Sea of Tragic Beasts from 2019. A perfect deathcore record that completely altered my brain chemistry. I give this an easy 5 out of 5. And now we come to the album that I've listened to enough that I didn't actually have to re-listen to know exactly where I'd place it. Don't worry, I did out of interest of fairness for the ranking, but the point stands that I very well knew what I was getting into here. If you take every good thing I've said about Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell, and The Great Collapse, and I suppose Oh What the Future Holds too, and multiply those things a handful of times, you might manage to approximate the things I could praise The Sea of Tragic Beasts for. The Great Collapse was the nail in the coffin for my reservations about deathcore, but The Sea of Tragic Beasts is what did, and yet does, cement Fit for an Autopsy as my favorite working in the genre today. I can recall having mixed expectations going into this album when it released, because the only single I had heard was Mirrors, and it wasn't quite what I was expecting, but as it turned out, I didn't dislike a single song in the full release. Every single thing the band did here, they did perfectly, and it continued the trend the band had going in the 2010s of every single album managing to top the last one somehow. The Sea of Tragic Beasts is an easy 5 out of 5 perfection and most likely a top 10 album of all time in my eyes, easily my favorite deathcore album out there. I quite enjoy drumming a few songs on this one, even though I often struggle with performing deathcore material. Well, I still struggle to perform any of these parts, but I enjoy them too much to let my inability to nail them get me down. Finally, The Sea of Tragic Beasts contains the highest proportion of my favorite songs by the band, which reflects itself in the vast majority of the Fit for an Autopsy moments I can conjure off the top of my head being from this very record, even when I listen to all of the rest of them over again before revisiting this one. Oh, and my favorite breakdown they've ever written is here. In fact, I love this album so much, I'm going to break the trend of 3 standout tracks with one of them being my favorite, like I've done with all the previous albums, not counting the first album where I didn't select a favorite. Standout tracks from The Sea of Tragic Beasts include the title track, The Sea of Tragic Beasts, No Man is Without Fear, and Your Pain is Mine, all 3 of which I would consider my favorite song on the album, as well as Mirrors, Unloved, and Warfare. I am entirely unsure of what the reaction to my list might be. Let me know below what you agree or disagree with. Also, be sure to give me your own ranking for the band's work, as I'd be interested in seeing how others generally tend to land with the work compared to me. Maybe I've got some hot takes, and maybe I don't. I'll let you be the judge of that. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with a review for the new Linkin Park album, likely next week, and an entire Linkin Park discography ranking, hopefully the week after that, if I can. If you're interested in either of those, let me know by leaving a like and subscribing. You know, all the monotonous YouTube stuff that everybody tells you to do. Thank you once again for watching. I hope to see you guys next week.